The sky above us is a lie, a comforting, brilliant lie. For all of human history, we have looked up and seen a placid blue dome by day, a predictable tapestry of stars by night. We built our gods there, our myths, our calendars. We built our civilization on the bedrock assumption that the heavens were orderly, distant, and benign. The sun rose and set with metronomic precision. The seasons turned. The cosmos was clockwork. But we were wrong. The universe is not a machine. It is a living, breathing, and occasionally violent entity, governed by laws of physics that care nothing for our schedules, our economies, or our survival. And in the closing months of the year 2025, that violent indifference has focused into a single, terrifying point on the surface of our sun. A dark, roiling cancer of magnetism so large and so out of place that it has quietly shattered the predictions of every solar physicist on the planet. It is a cosmic anomaly that shouldn't exist, pointing directly at us, and its arrival heralds a week that could change everything. They have given it dry, bureaucratic names: Active Region 4294, 4295, and 4296. 3 designations for what is in truth a single, monstrous entity. In the hushed technical corridors of the Space Weather Prediction Center, in Boulder, Colorado, and in similar facilities from Exeter to Tokyo, analysts stare at data streams with a professional dread that borders on awe. They measure its magnetic shear, track its sunspot umbrae, and calculate probabilities. What they are not doing is screaming from the rooftops. Publicly, the bulletins are calm, peppered with terms like enhanced activity and elevated flare potential. Privately, in the language of those who understand the stakes, this cluster represents something far more profound, a potential civilization-ending event. It is the loaded gun placed on the table of human history. The only question now is whether the sun will pull the trigger. To understand the depth of this threat, we must begin not with the monster itself, but with its warning shot. Rewind the clock to 0200 Universal Time on December 1st, 2020, while most of the world slept or scrolled through silent feeds, or began a mundane Monday. The universe conducted a live-fire exercise. From a region on the sun then catalogued as AR4299, a fragment of the larger beast still hidden around the solar limb, a ferocious explosion ripped through the sun's outer atmosphere. This was an X1.9 class solar flare, a designation reserved for the most powerful category of stellar outbursts. In a silent cataclysm of energy, magnetic field lines, twisted beyond their limit, snapped and reconfigured. The energy released was equivalent to billions of hydrogen bombs detonating simultaneously. A pulse of extreme ultraviolet and X-ray radiation, travelling at the speed of light, raced across the 93 million mile void between the Sun and Earth. 8 minutes and 20 seconds after the explosion, that invisible tsunami of high-energy photons slammed into the dayside of our planet. It struck the ionosphere, that fragile electrically charged layer of the upper atmosphere between 50 and 600 miles up that we rely on to bounce radio signals over the horizon. The effect was not subtle. The ionosphere struck by this sudden blast reacted like a struck gong. Ionization spiked violently. Electrons were stripped from atoms in a chaotic surge. And across a vast sweep of the planet, encompassing all of Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Eastern Indian Ocean, a critical layer of the ionosphere essential for high-frequency HF radio propagation simply dissolved. It didn't fade, it vanished. In practical human terms, this meant that for at least 30 minutes, long-range radio communications across an entire hemisphere went dark. This was not a minor static hiss. This was a total radio frequency blackout, rated as an R3 event on the official scale, a strong disruption. Pilots flying transoceanic routes over the Pacific suddenly found their headsets filled with a profound, unnatural silence. The constant, reassuring chatter from air traffic control in Brisbane or Perth was gone, replaced by a hissing void. Aircraft, following strict contingency protocols, immediately began switching to satellite-based systems where available, or altering course to stay within range of shorter-range VHF ground stations. Over the vast, empty stretches of the Indian Ocean, maritime vessels lost their ability to send or receive HF distress signals, weather updates, or routine traffic reports. For those 30 minutes, entire swathes of the planet's surface, and the aircraft and ships upon them, were plunged into a communications isolation not felt since the dawn of the wireless age, and then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The ionosphere, resilient and dynamic, slowly began to recover. The radios crackled back to life. Flights continued. Ships sailed on. The evening news cycles, dominated by politics and local dramas, never mentioned it. There were no headlines about planes falling from the sky, because thanks to trained pilots and redundant systems, none did. The global public slept through the event entirely, but within a small community of space weather forecasters, emergency planners, and military communications specialists, the December 1st blackout sent a shockwave of a different kind. It was not a disaster. It was a demonstration. A clear, unequivocal message from the sun. I can reach out and touch you, and your most critical systems are fragile. The official space weather bulletin from NOAA that day was a masterpiece of understatement. It noted the X1.9 flare, confirmed the R3 radio blackout, and regarding the massive coronal mass ejection, CME, of magnetized plasma that billowed out after the flare, offered this crucial, calming phrase: analysis indicates the CME is not Earth-directed. For the public, that was the end of the story, a near miss, nothing to see here. But for those who parsed the language of these agencies like theologians deciphering scripture, other phrases held more ominous weight. The flare was noted as originating from the complex magnetic field of former AR-4274. That single word, former, is a key that unlocks a deeper unease. Solar physicists do not casually reassign active region numbers. When they do, it signifies a fundamental reorganization, a mutation. The magnetic topology of that patch of the sun had changed so dramatically it was considered a new entity. AR-4279 was not a stable spot. It was an evolving, growing threat. And as later imagery would confirm, AR-42299 was merely the vanguard, the first visible tendril of the massive, interconnected complex still rotating into view from the sun's far side, the triple region behemoth AR-4294-4296. This brings us to the heart of the anomaly. Solar Cycle 25, which began in December 2019, was forecast by all major consensus models to be a quiet one. Similar to the historically weak Cycle 24, it was predicted to have a mild peak around 2025 and then gently decline. The sun, in our scientific hubris, was supposed to behave. Instead, starting in late 2024, it began to overperform. Sunspot numbers climbed faster than predicted. Large, complex active regions appeared with unsettling frequency. X-class flares, which should have been rare events, began popping weekly. The solar dynamo, the chaotic, poorly understood engine deep within the sun that generates its magnetic field, was evidently running hotter than our models could account for. And now, as the cycle was supposedly past its peak, it had produced its most glaring contradiction yet, a sunspot cluster of a size and complexity that belonged to the climax of a historically strong cycle, not its declining phase. The cluster AR-4294-4296 is not just large, it is structurally aberrant. Typically, a sunspot is a relatively simple thing, a concentrated bundle of magnetic flux breaking through the solar surface, with a clear north polarity in its dark centre, the umbra, and a south polarity in the surrounding less dark region, the penumbra, or vice versa. The magnetic field lines arch up and loop back down in orderly arcs. But in magnetically complex regions, this order breaks down. Imagine taking the magnetic field lines not as neat loops, but as countless ropes submerged in a turbulent, superheated fluid. Now twist those ropes, knot them, braid them together until north and south polarities are not separated but intimately tangled, forced into close proximity along jagged, stressed boundaries called polarity inversion lines. This is the reality of AR-4294-4296. It is a snarl of magnetic tension. Where opposite polarities are forced together, the magnetic field seeks to simplify, to reconnect. This reconnection process is what unleashes the fury of a solar flare or the accelerating punch of a CME. The larger and more complex the tangle, the greater the pent-up energy, and the more catastrophic the potential release. The fact that this cluster required 3 separate AR numbers is, in itself, a screaming alarm siren. It is the solar equivalent of hurricane hunters flying into a storm system so vast that the National Hurricane Center is forced to designate it as 3 separate hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Jose, even though it is one interconnected meteorological monster. Each subregion within the cluster has its own magnetic personality, its own unstable configurations, its own potential to trigger a chain reaction that could ignite the entire complex. The geometry is what truly terrifies forecasters. Due to the Sun's 27-day rotation, this massive, armed and dangerous cluster is now turning to face Earth. Between December 4th and 7th, it will be positioned squarely in the centre of the solar disk, the optimal firing position for an Earth-directed cataclysm. We are moving into the crosshairs. Compounding this is the silent internal reassessment happening within forecasting agencies. The public probabilities for X-class flares may read 30% chance in the next 48 hours, a number that seems abstract. But those numbers have been quietly and steadily revised upwards since the cluster's arrival. Furthermore, forecast models are now accounting for the arrival of a coronal hole high-speed stream around the same window. Coronal holes are vast, dark regions in the Sun's corona where the magnetic field opens out into space, allowing solar wind to rush out at speeds exceeding 500 miles per second. When this fast stream of particles reaches Earth a few days later, it buffets and compresses our planet's magnetosphere, like a heavyweight boxer jabbing at the opponent's guard, tenderizing it before the big punch. If a fast, massive CME from AR 4294-4296 were to arrive during or just after this buffeting, the combined effect could overwhelm our magnetic defences in a way a CME alone might not. The silence from official public channels is deafening. Why isn't this front-page news? The reasons are a complex, frustrating web of institutional psychology and cold calculation. First, space weather is chronically unsexy until it becomes catastrophic. It lacks the immediate visual drama of a hurricane or the human narrative of a pandemic. Second, agencies like NOAA and NASA are pathologically averse to inciting panic, especially when dealing with probabilistic forecasts. A false alarm could cripple their credibility. Third, and perhaps most cynically, publicly underscoring this vulnerability forces an uncomfortable conversation about preparedness, or the staggering lack thereof. Admitting that a natural event could collapse the grid invites brutal questions. Why haven't we hardened our transformers? Why are our satellites so fragile? Why have we built a globally interconnected society with the resilience of a house of cards? It is politically and economically easier to whisper in technical bulletins and hope the storm passes than to shout a warning and be forced to spend the billions required to fortify our world. This institutional quiet stands in stark contrast to the historical precedent that haunts every discussion of space weather, the Carrington Event of September 1859. When a colossal CME struck Earth then, the technological pinnacle of the age was the telegraph. Operators were shocked by sparks leaping from their machines. Some found they could disconnect the batteries and still send messages using only the currents induced in the wires by the geomagnetic storm. Auroras, normally confined to polar latitudes, blazed red and green as far south as the Caribbean. It was a world-changing event for the 19th century. But the key difference between 1859 and 2025 is not the strength of the storm, it is the strength of our dependence. In 1859, humanity lived alongside technology. Today, we live inside it. We are not separate from our grid. Our grid is our circulatory system. We are not users of satellites. They are the invisible scaffolding of our finance, navigation, communication, and power distribution. A Carrington-level event today would not cause telegraph wires to spark. It would cause extra high voltage, EHV, transformers, the multi-hundred-ton, custom-built, irreplaceable hearts of our power grid, to melt into useless slag from the inside out. Geomagnetically induced currents, GICs. Vast, slow electrical currents driven by the violently shifting planetary magnetic field would flood into the power lines seeking ground. These currents would saturate transformer cores, causing them to overheat and fail, potentially by the hundreds across a continent. The grid would not simply go dark, it would shatter, and with it would go water pumps, refrigeration, fuel distribution, sewage treatment, digital communication, and the just-in-time supply chain that delivers food to cities. The collapse would not be an inconvenience. It would be a cascading failure of the basic pillars of modern society. Studies from the National Academy of Sciences and insurance conglomerates estimate recovery times in years, not weeks, and economic costs in the trillions. This is the shadow that falls across the first days of December 2025. The sunspot cluster AR4294-4296 is the gun. The magnetic shear building along its polarity lines is the hammer being drawn back. The window from December 4th to 7th is the moment the barrel swings to point between our eyes. The Australia blackout was the click of the safety being switched off. We are now in the final breathless pause. In the parts to come, we will dissect this weapon in detail. We will explore the anatomy of a CME, model the precise scenarios of the kill window, and venture into the terrifying realm beyond Carrington, to events in the geological record that suggest the Sun is capable of far, far worse. We will expose the hidden fragilities in our orbital infrastructure and confront the grim institutional silence that leaves us unprepared. This is not a speculative fiction. It is a real-time observation of a potential pivot point in human history, playing out in the silent fusion furnace of our local star. The data is on the screens, the clock is ticking, and almost no one is talking about it. To comprehend the threat poised by the sunspot cluster, AR4294-4296, one must move beyond the abstract and into the visceral, chaotic reality of stellar magnetism. This is not merely a dark spot on the Sun, it is a sprawling, seething metropolis of magnetic energy, a cosmic pressure cooker whose rivets are beginning to groan. Its very existence at this late stage of solar cycle 25 is a profound anomaly, a breach of the rules that govern our star's behaviour. Understanding its anatomy is not an academic exercise. It is an act of diagnosing a patient whose fever is spiking toward a fatal crescendo. The solar cycle is driven by the Sun's internal dynamo, a self-sustaining engine of plasma motion and magnetism buried deep within its convective zone. Every 11 years, this dynamo reaches a peak of activity, manifesting as a maximum in sunspot numbers and solar storms, before winding down toward a minimum. The leading predictive models for cycle 25, based on precursor measurements and analogies to past cycles, unanimously pointed toward a weak to moderate peak. The Sun, however, is not bound by our algorithms. Starting in late 2024, observational data began to diverge sharply from the predictions. Sunspot numbers climbed a steeper slope. The magnetic flux emerging at the surface was stronger, more tangled. It was as if the Sun's internal engine had been fitted with a more powerful turbine. AR4294-4296 is the most glaring product of this overperformance. Its most immediate shocking feature is its sheer physical scale. When viewed through hydrogen alpha telescopes, or the sophisticated instruments aboard satellites like NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory, the cluster dominates the solar disk. To put it in earthly terms, if one could pluck this complex from the Sun and place it on Earth, its dark umbral cores alone would span a continent. Its full magnetic influence, including the surrounding penumbral filaments and associated bright plage, would envelop a significant fraction of the solar hemisphere facing us. This size matters for one fundamental reason: the energy available for release scales with the volume and complexity of the magnetic field. A small, simple sunspot might muster enough energy for a modest C-class flare. A region of this magnitude can, and history shows does, store the energy equivalent of billions of megatons of TNT, ready to be unleashed in an X-class cataclysm. The assignment of 3 separate active region numbers is a critical diagnostic detail. In solar physics, an active region AR number is assigned to a coherent contiguous area of magnetic complexity. For a single structure to be so vast and internally divided that it requires 3 numbers is exceptionally rare. It tells scientists that within this megacluster, there are at least 3 distinct semi-autonomous knots of magnetic instability. Each has its own magnetic polarity arrangement, its own internal stresses. Think of it not as one volcano, but as a volcanic field where 3 major calderas are interconnected by subsurface magma channels. An eruption in one could destabilize the others, triggering a chain reaction. This interconnectedness transforms the cluster from a simple hazard into a systemic risk. Delving deeper into its magnetic architecture reveals the true source of the danger. Data from instruments like the helioseismic and magnetic imager, HMI, allow physicists to map the magnetic field vector at the solar surface. The maps of AR4294-4296 are not clean pictures of black and white north and south. They are a Jackson Pollock painting of chaos. Areas of strong positive, north, and negative, south, magnetic flux are not neatly segregated into the classic bipolar sunspot structure. Instead, they are intermingled, jammed together in a tortured jigsaw. The boundaries where these opposing fields are forced into direct contact are called polarity inversion lines, PLs. These are the fault lines of the solar surface. Along these PLs, the magnetic field is under immense stress. The opposing field lines are like armies pressed against each other, desperate to reconfigure into a lower energy state through a process called magnetic reconnection. It is this reconnection that is the fundamental engine of solar explosions. When the stress becomes too great, the field lines snap and reconnect in a new, simpler configuration. The colossal difference in magnetic energy before and after this reconnection is not dissipated gently. It is converted violently into heat, light, and kinetic energy, the flash of a solar flare and the acceleration of a coronal mass ejection. The longer and more convoluted the polarity inversion lines, and the stronger the magnetic field strengths on either side, the greater the potential energy release. In AR 4294, 4296, the PLs are not short, neat divides. They are long, sinuous, and ragged, weaving through the heart of the cluster like cracks in a dam under immense pressure. Further evidence of the region's instability comes from its dynamic behavior. It did not form placidly. Over a period of approximately 48 hours, it erupted into view on the solar eastern limb. For a magnetic structure of this scale to emerge so rapidly suggests a ferocious upwelling of magnetic flux from the sun's toroidal interior. It was a sudden, forceful intrusion, not a gradual accumulation. Once present, it exhibited signs of persistent, restless activity. The plage surrounding it, bright patches in the chromosphere caused by intense magnetic heating, glowed with an unusually fierce intensity. The penumbral filaments, those dark radial streaks surrounding the central umbrae of the largest spots, were observed to be elongated and twisted, a visual signature of magnetic shear. In some datasets, analysts detected hints of rotational motion within the spots themselves, a clear indicator that the magnetic footpoints were being wrung like wet towels, storing even more energy in the process. This combination of size, magnetic complexity, and dynamic unrest is what defines a magnetically complex region in the parlance of forecasters. It is the precursor condition for the most powerful solar events on record. Historical analogues loom large in the minds of those watching AR 4294, 4296. In October 2003, a series of large, complex active regions produced the Halloween storms, a barrage of solar flares and CMEs that caused satellite failures, communication blackouts, and forced aircraft rerouting. One of those flares was so powerful it saturated the sensors on the observing satellites, an X-28 Plus event whose true magnitude could only be estimated. More pertinently, in March 1989, a massive sunspot group, magnetically complex and directly Earth-facing, launched a CME that struck our planet. The resulting geomagnetic storm induced currents in the Hydro-Quebec power grid that collapsed the system within 92 seconds, leaving 6 million people in Canada without power for 9 hours during a freezing winter night. That region was a fraction of the size of R4296. The Quebec event was a stark lesson in modern vulnerability, but it was also, in a grim sense, a lucky break. The storm was severe, but not Carrington level. The CME's magnetic orientation was damaging, but not optimally so. The grid infrastructure, while vulnerable, was less integrated and dependent than today's. It was a warning shot that grazed us. AR 4294, 4296 has the potential to be the direct hit we have thus far avoided. The final, chilling piece of anatomical analysis concerns its placement on the Sun. The cluster is located in the Sun's northern hemisphere at a mid-latitude. This is significant because of the Sun's differential rotation. Its equator spins faster than its poles. This shear helps wind up the global magnetic field over the course of the cycle. The latitude of AR 4294, 4296 is precisely where some of the most geo-effective regions of past cycles have emerged. More importantly, due to the Sun's axial tilt and the geometry of the ecliptic plane, active regions at these latitudes, when positioned near the center of the solar disk, are optimally connected to Earth via the Parker spiral, the path carved out by the solar wind. A CME launched from this location, at this time, is far more likely to make a beeline for our planet than one launched from near the solar limbs. As of December 3rd, the cluster is completing its transit onto the Earth-facing disk. Forecast models, which track solar rotation with exquisite precision, place it dead center from December 4th through the 7th. This is the window of concern, the period of maximum geo-effectiveness. During this window, any eruption will have a high probability of being Earth-directed. The Sun, having built this monstrous weapon of magnetism, is now swinging it to aim directly at us. The trigger for an eruption could be internal, a final twist in the magnetic rope that exceeds its breaking point. It could be external, a destabilizing wave from elsewhere on the Sun, or even the shearing influence of solar rotation itself. The precise moment is unpredictable, a testament to the chaotic nature of magnetized plasma. But the conditions for a historic eruption are not just present, they are glaringly, overwhelmingly manifest. In the quiet rooms where space weather is monitored, the atmosphere is one of tense vigilance. Screens display real-time X-ray flux graphs from the GEOES satellites, magnetograms from SDO, and coronagraph imagery from the SOHO and Stereo spacecraft, watching for the telltale halo of a CME. Probability figures for X-class flares and proton events are updated hourly. The language remains technical, but the subtext is screaming. They are watching a building whose foundations are cracking, counting the seconds until the collapse. They know the anatomy of this monster in intimate, terrifying detail. They know its strength, its instability, and its aim. What they cannot know is the exact second it will decide to strike. That uncertainty is the thread from which the next chapter of human history now dangles. The Australia HF blackout of December 1st was not an isolated weather event. It was a diagnostic probe fired by the Sun into the very fabric of our technological society, and the readouts were alarming. To dismiss it as a 30-minute radio glitch is to fundamentally misunderstand its message. It was a live demonstration, in a controlled theatre of operations, of how effortlessly a moderate solar flare can dismantle a critical layer of our global infrastructure. It was the Sun showing us its playbook, and for those who know how to read it, the implications for the coming days are nothing short of terrifying. Let us dissect the event with forensic detail. At Euro 200 UTC, the X-129 flare from AR 4299, the forward outpost of the larger cluster, reached its peak intensity in the soft X-ray band. This electromagnetic pulse, comprising high-energy ultraviolet and X-ray photons, crossed the void unimpeded. There is no shielding from this. It travels at light speed, giving no warning. Upon impact with Earth's dayside, it did not strike the surface. It struck the ionosphere, a region we have engineered our world to depend upon without ever truly seeing it. This sudden influx of energy dramatically increased the ionization of the D and E layers, particularly over the sunlit hemisphere. In the D layer, about 50-55 miles up, which typically absorbs high-frequency radio waves during the day, the ionization became so intense that it turned from a partial absorber into a near-perfect mirror, but a mirror that reflected signals into oblivion rather than back to Earth. In the F layer higher up, 150-plus miles, critical for long-distance HF skip communication, the sudden ionization created chaotic, dense plasma structures that scattered and absorbed radio waves instead of cleanly reflecting them. The result was a near-total suppression of HF propagation across the affected region. The technical term is sudden ionospheric disturbance, SID, but that bland phrase masks the operational chaos. For aviation, the consequences were immediate and serious. Pilots on long-haul routes over the Pacific, reliant on HF to communicate with oceanic control centres in Auckland, Brisbane or San Francisco, found their primary link severed. Protocol immediately shifted to contingency measures, switching to satellite communications, SATCOM if equipped, or altering course to remain within line-of-sight range of ground-based VHF stations, which have a much shorter range but are not affected by ionospheric disturbances. This forced deviations, burned extra fuel, and created traffic management headaches. For aircraft without robust SATCOM, it meant periods of procedural isolation, flying blind in a communication sense, relying on pre-filed flight plans, and the hope that other aircraft were doing the same. On the high seas, the impact was equally profound. The Global Maritime Distress and Safety System, GMDSS, relies on HF bands for long-range safety communications in vast ocean areas beyond VHF and satellite coverage. For 30 minutes, a swath of the Indian and Pacific Oceans went comms dark. A vessel in distress during that window would have found its HF distress calls swallowed by the static. Routine traffic coordination, weather facsimile broadcasts, which ships used to chart storms, and safety bulletins were interrupted. The maritime world was forced, briefly, back into an era of greater isolation and risk. This was an R3 level blackout, the third strongest on a 5-point scale. It caused wide-area HF radio communication blackout on the sunlit side of Earth, and loss of radio contact for tens of minutes, as the official scale describes. But here is the critical, unspoken part of that description. It was caused by an X1.9 flare. That is a powerful flare, but it sits at the lower end of the X-class spectrum. X-class flares are logarithmic. An X2 is twice as powerful as an X1, and X10 is 10 times as powerful. The historical record contains flares measured at X20, X28, and beyond. The 2003 Halloween storms featured an X17 and the sensor-saturating X28 plus event. The Carrington Event flare of 1859 is estimated to have been well above X40, possibly far higher. The December 1st event, therefore, was not the Sun's maximum effort. It was a moderate effort, and with that moderate effort, it completely disabled a specific vital technology across a hemisphere for half an hour. This is the core of the warning. Our margin of safety is illusory. The ionospheric shield we depend on for global HF communication is tissue paper thin against even a modest solar outburst. If an X1.9 can do this, the effects of an X10 or X20 flare are almost incomprehensible. The blackout would be deeper, wider, and could last for hours. It would not be confined to one hemisphere. As the flare-illuminated region of the ionosphere moved with the Sun's terminator, the blackout would sweep across the entire planet over the course of a day. But the radio blackout is merely the opening act, the flash of light from the muzzle. The real projectile, the coronal mass ejection, is slower, more massive, and infinitely more dangerous. The CME associated with the December 1st flare was, thankfully, not aimed at us. But it provided a perfect observational case study. Coronagraph imagery from the SOHO spacecraft showed a classic bright, full-halo CME exploding symmetrically from the Sun. Analysis put its speed at approximately 1/200 km per second, a fast but not exceptional speed. Had it been Earth-directed, it would have arrived in about 34 hours. This is the true threat that AR 4294-4296 holds over the December 4-7 window. Not just another disruptive flare, but a direct CME hit. The blackout taught us two more subtle, yet critical lessons about institutional and public preparedness. First, the response was almost entirely internal to the affected industries. Airlines executed their checklists. Maritime authorities noted the disturbance. There was no public alert, no mainstream media coverage. The event was managed silently by technical specialists, compartmentalized away from public awareness. This reveals a system that treats such disruptions as operational hiccups to be managed, not as harbingers of systemic risk to be communicated. The institutional memory for space weather events is notoriously short. The lessons of Quebec 1989 or the Halloween storms of 2003 fade, replaced by the press of daily business. Infrastructure upgrades for resilience are costly and offer no visible return on investment until a catastrophe strikes, at which point it is too late. Second, the event exposed a dangerous public complacency, born of ignorance. Because the lights didn't flicker and phones still had service, relying on cellular towers and undersea cables, not the ionosphere, the world at large experienced no disruption. This reinforces the false notion that solar storms are a niche concern for astronomers and ham radio operators, not a clear and present danger to civilization. This complacency is a luxury we can no longer afford. The Australia blackout was a tremor. The main quake, a direct CME impact from the now perfectly positioned AR 4294-4296, is what looms in the immediate forecast. That forecast hinges on a confluence of factors set to align between December 4th and 7th. The monster cluster will be centered on the Sun. A high-speed solar wind stream from a large coronal hole is predicted to begin buffeting Earth's magnetosphere around December 5th, preconditioning it for instability. Into this primed and stressed system, AR 4294-4296 could launch its payload. The nature of that payload will determine our future. Scenario A, the region produces only flares, or a CME that misses Earth or has a benign magnetic orientation. We experience more R3 level blackouts, satellite operators grapple with radiation-induced reboots, and auroras dance at high latitudes. A period of heightened operational stress, but no collapse. Scenario B, a direct fast CME, 1,000–1,500 km/s, with a moderately southward magnetic field, BZ, arrives. This would likely generate a G3–G4 level geomagnetic storm. Power grids experience widespread voltage instability and strong geomagnetically induced currents, GICs. Grid operators implement emergency measures to shed load and protect transformers. Some transformers may overheat and fail locally. Satellites experience severe charging and radiation damage, some are lost. GPS accuracy degrades for days. Polar flights are rerouted. Significant economic damage accrues, but recovery is measured in weeks. Scenario C, the nightmare. AR4294-4296 unleashes a Carrington-class eruption, an X20+ flare followed by an extremely fast, over 2,000 km/s, massive CME with a strongly and persistently southward BZ. It arrives during the coronal hole stream. The combined impact drives a G5+ geomagnetic storm, exceeding all modern benchmarks. The resulting GICs are not mere fluctuations, they are continent-scale tidal waves of electricity seeking ground through the path of least resistance, our high-voltage transmission lines and transformers. The simultaneous widespread saturation and failure of EHV transformers would be instantaneous and catastrophic. The grid doesn't go down, it is destroyed from within. The blackout is not rolling, it is permanent for vast regions until new transformers, each requiring 12 to 18 months to build, can be manufactured and installed. This is the scenario that transitions from a severe weather event to a humanitarian and civilizational catastrophe. The Australia blackout was the proof of concept. It proved the sun's ability to effortlessly disrupt a foundational technology. It proved our systemic fragility to even a moderate event, and it proved that the mechanisms for a world-altering disaster are not theoretical. They are active, observable, and currently aimed at us. The 30 minutes of radio silence over the Pacific was not an ending, it was an overture. The main performance is scheduled for the days ahead, and the star of the show, AR4294-4296, has just taken centre stage. The period between December 4th and 7th, 2025 is not marked on any public calendar. No holidays fall within it. For the vast majority of humanity, it will be an unremarkable stretch of early winter days, a push toward the year's end. But in the realm of space weather forecasting, and for the integrity of modern civilization, this 96-hour span constitutes a kill window, a period where orbital mechanics, solar physics, and terrestrial vulnerability converge into a nexus of extreme risk. It is a moment in time when the dice are in the air, and the stakes are the continued functioning of the electrical and technological world. The countdown to this window is governed by the implacable rotation of the sun. AR4294-4296, having festered and grown on the far side, is now fully visible on the Earth-facing hemisphere. Solar rotation models, refined over decades, place it at a central meridian passage, directly facing our planet, throughout this period. This geometry is crucial. A coronal mass ejection launched from the centre of the solar disk travels roughly along the Sun-Earth line, the ecliptic plane. This is the highway between our star and our planet. A CME launched from the limbs of the Sun, in contrast, is likely to miss us entirely, its plasma cloud billowing out into space on a divergent path. From December 4th–7, any significant eruption from the heart of the monster cluster is essentially guaranteed to be Earth-directed. The Sun's aim for this brief window is perfect. Compounding this primary threat is a secondary conditioning factor. Space weather forecasters are closely tracking a large recurrent coronal hole, a dark magnetically open region in the Sun's corona that has rotated into an Earth-facing position. Coronal holes are sources of fast solar wind, streams of charged particles escaping along open magnetic field lines at speeds often exceeding 800 km per second. This particular stream is predicted to begin washing over Earth's magnetosphere around December 5th. The impact of a fast solar wind stream is to compress and energize Earth's magnetic field on the day side and to stretch it into a long tail on the night side. It stirs the system, pumping energy into the Van Allen radiation belts and making the entire magnetosphere more twitchy, more reactive. Think of it as a meteorological precursor, a period of falling barometric pressure and gusty winds before the hurricane's eyewall arrives. If a major CME from AR 4294, 4296 plows into this already disturbed and preconditioned system, the coupling efficiency, the transfer of energy from the solar storm to Earth's environment, can be dramatically enhanced. The effects are not additive, they are multiplicative. The ultimate determinant of catastrophe, however, lies in a subtle magnetic variable that cannot be predicted until the CME is almost upon us. The orientation of its embedded magnetic field, specifically its north-south component known as BIS in GSM coordinates. This is the master switch for geomagnetic havoc. If the CME's magnetic field is oriented northward, BES positive, upon arrival, it largely slides off Earth's magnetosphere. The fields are aligned in a way that promotes deflection. The energy transfer is minimal, resulting in a milder storm, often with beautiful auroras but limited destruction. If, however, the field is oriented southward, BES negative, it connects explosively with Earth's northward-oriented magnetic field at the dayside magnetopause. This process, called magnetic reconnection, rips open the protective shield, allowing solar wind plasma and energy to flood directly into the inner magnetosphere. The more southward the BZ and the longer it remains so, the more violent the resulting geomagnetic storm. We have no way of accurately forecasting B's orientation days in advance. The magnetic field is tangled within the CME cloud and can rotate unpredictably during its transit. Our first reliable measurement comes from spacecraft stationed at the Lagrange L1 point, about 1 million miles upstream from Earth, satellites like NASA's Dioscova or the NOAA NASA ACE spacecraft. These guardians in the solar wind can provide a definitive reading of the CME's density, speed, and magnetic field about 30 to 60 minutes before it hits. That is the sum total of our definitive warning for the most critical parameter, 1 hour. In that hour, grid operators must decide whether to take drastic, costly protective actions, like deliberately shutting down portions of the grid to prevent transformer damage. Historically, the social and economic cost of a preemptive blackout has been deemed too high to act on such short, probabilistic notice. The default, therefore, is to hope and react after impact, a strategy that may prove fatal in the face of a Carrington-level event. Let us walk through the scenarios for the kill window, from the manageable to the apocalyptic. Scenario 1. The whiff. The sunspot cluster remains unstable, but does not produce a major Earth-directed eruption. It might release flares that cause radio blackouts, like the December 1st event, but any CMEs are slow, weak, or off-target. The coronal hole stream arrives, causing a mild to moderate G1-G2 geomagnetic storm. Auroras are visible at mid-latitudes. Satellite operators deal with minor orbit adjustments and temporary communication glitches. Power grids experience negligible effects. The world breathes a sigh of relief, and the profound vulnerabilities exposed by the scare are once again relegated to the back burner. This is the most likely outcome in any probabilistic sense, but it does nothing to reduce the risk next time. Scenario 2. The glancing blow. AR 4-9294-42-Sun6 launches a fast CME, but its magnetic orientation is largely northward or variable. Alternatively, the CME's core misses Earth, delivering only a glancing impact. The result is a strong G3 or severe G4 geomagnetic storm. This is the Quebec 1989 scenario, updated for 2025. Power grids across high-latitude regions, like North America, Europe, Northern Asia, experience significant stress. Voltage regulators struggle to compensate. Geomagnetically induced currents, GICs, flow, causing transformers to hum and heat. Grid operators implement manual load shedding and reroute power to avoid overtaxing critical transformers. Some satellites go into safe mode, others suffer permanent damage from radiation. GPS accuracy degrades for hours or days, affecting aviation, maritime, and precision agriculture. High-frequency radio is blacked out across sunlit hemispheres for extended periods. Polar flights are cancelled. The economic impact is in the billions. Recovery takes weeks, and it serves as a brutal wake-up call. It is a disaster, but not a civilization ender. Scenario 3. The direct hit. This is the Carrington-class scenario that haunts contingency plans. The cluster unleashes an X-20+ flare and a subsequent CME of exceptional speed, 2,000 km, and mass. The CME travels the Sun-Earth distance in less than 18 hours. Its magnetic field, measured by Deskova in the final hour, shows a powerfully and persistently southward BZ. It arrives as the coronal hole stream has already stressed the magnetosphere. The impact is not a storm, it is a geomagnetic shockwave. The initial effect is a sudden, extreme compression of the magnetosphere on the day side. Within minutes, intense GICs begin flowing in every long conductor on the planet, most notably in the continent-spanning networks of high-voltage transmission lines. These currents, which can reach hundreds of amperes, are direct current, DC, overlays on the grid's alternating current, AC. Transformers are not designed for this. The DC current drives the transformer core into half-cycle saturation, causing it to overheat violently, distort the AC waveform, and create harmonic currents that damage other equipment. Protective relays sense the abnormality and trip, but the GICs are ubiquitous, affecting hundreds of substations simultaneously. The failure is not sequential, it is near instantaneous across a synchrogrid region. Major extra high voltage, or EHV transformers, the massive custom-built behemoths at the heart of the grid, begin to fail. Some may explode, others simply melt their internal wiring, silently turning into multi-million-dollar paperweights. As these critical nodes fail, the grid fragments into isolated islands that cannot sustain themselves and subsequently collapse. Within an hour, rolling blackouts begin. Within a few hours, the blackouts are no longer rolling. They are permanent for regions spanning multiple time zones. The lights go out, and they do not come back on. This is where Scenario 3 diverges from all previous disasters. The power outage is not the crisis. It is the trigger for a cascading multi-system collapse. Water and sanitation. Municipal water systems lose pressure within hours as electric pumps fail. Gravity-fed reservoirs provide a short buffer, but treatment plants cease operation. Within days, the tap runs dry. Without power for purification, waterborne disease risks skyrocket. Sewage treatment plants back up, creating a public health catastrophe. Fuel and transportation. Gas stations cannot pump fuel without electricity. Diesel reserves for backup generators at hospitals and critical facilities are exhausted in days. The just-in-time supply chain for trucking collapses as vehicles run out of fuel. Food and medical supplies stop moving. Communications. Cellular towers have limited battery backup, 4 to 8 hours. Landlines and internet infrastructure fail as central offices lose power and batteries deplete. Society is plunged into an information blackout, fueling rumour and fear. Finance and commerce. The digital financial system seizes. ATMs fail. Credit cards become useless. Cash, if anyone has it, becomes king. But commerce grinds to a halt without logistics. Healthcare. Hospitals run on emergency generators, but fuel resupply fails. Dialysis machines, ventilators, refrigerated medicines, and surgical suites become unavailable. Chronic patients and the acutely ill face mortal danger. Social order. The rule of law is predicated on communication, transportation, and the basic provisioning of needs. As these evaporate within a week, social cohesion is tested to its breaking point. The 2005 Hurricane Katrina catastrophe in New Orleans would be a localized preview of a continental-scale breakdown. Recovery is not a matter of restoring power. It is a matter of rebuilding the central nervous system of society from scratch, in a world where the manufacturing base to do so, which requires electricity, has also collapsed. Replacement EHV transformers have a lead time of 12 to 18 months in the best of times. In a scenario where dozens or hundreds fail simultaneously and global manufacturing is crippled, the restoration timeline stretches into years. Studies by the US National Academy of Sciences and Lloyd's of London estimate economic costs in the multiple trillions of dollars and recovery periods of 4-10 years for a full Carrington-level event. This is the spectrum of possibility contained within the December 4/7 kill window. The models can outline the scenarios, but they cannot choose which one will manifest. That decision rests with the chaotic magnetic dance within AR 4294, 4296. As forecasters watch the real-time data, the X-ray flux, the magnetograms, the coronagraphs, they are waiting for the first sign of a liftoff, the telltale brightening of a major flare, followed by the expanding halo in the SOHO coronagraph. From that moment, the countdown to impact begins. For Scenario 3, that countdown may be less than a day, and the response time for meaningful action is less than an hour. We are in the era of consequence, waiting for the sky to fall, with only a fragile pane of magnetic glass between us and the storm. The Carrington Event of 1859 is more than a historical footnote. It is a phantom limb of our technological age, a ghost of a catastrophe that missed its true moment. In the 19th century, its effects were spectacular, but ultimately limited. A fascinating perturbation of the nascent telegraph network, a glorious light show. In the 21st century, an event of identical magnitude would not be a fascinating anomaly. It would be an extinction-level event for modern civilization as we know it. The term Carrington 2.0 is not hyperbole. It is the clinical name for a specific, well-modelled scenario in which a solar superstorm intersects with a world that has woven electricity into every strand of its being. As AR Force 2 Wiensind 4 4296 settles into its Earth-facing aim, we are not facing a repeat of 1859. We are facing its exponentially more dangerous descendant. The original Carrington event worked through a simple, elegant, and devastating mechanism: geomagnetically induced currents, GICs. When a Siamese shockwave and its following magnetic cloud compress and violently distort Earth's magnetosphere, the planet's own magnetic field lines are whipped back and forth. This rapid change in a magnetic field through a conductor induces an electrical current. The longer the conductor, the greater the induced voltage and current. In 1859, the longest conductors were telegraph wires, strung on wooden poles for hundreds of miles. The induced currents were strong enough to electrocute operators, spark fires, and allow phantom telegraphy. Today, the longest conductors on Earth are our high-voltage transmission lines, metal pipelines, and railway tracks. They form a planetary-scale antenna, perfectly tuned to harvest the energy of a fluctuating geomagnetic field and convert it into destructive direct current. The modern power grid is a marvel of efficiency, but its design harbours a fatal flaw in the face of GICs. At its core are extra-high voltage, EHV, transformers. These are not commodity items. They're colossal, custom-engineered devices, some weighing over 400 tons and as large as a house. A single unit can cost over $10 million and take well over a year to manufacture, test, and deliver. They are the choke points of the grid. When GICs enter the grid, they seek a path to ground. That path often leads directly through the windings of these transformers. The DC current causes the transformer's magnetic core to saturate on one half of the AC cycle. This leads to severe overheating, the production of intense internal harmonics, and mechanical vibration audible as a loud angry hum. Insulation fails. Windings melt or short. The transformer is destroyed, often catastrophically, with the potential for explosive mineral oil fires. In a Carrington 2.0 event, this would not happen to one transformer or a dozen. It would happen to scores, perhaps hundreds, almost simultaneously across an entire continent like North America or Europe. The grid is a network. The failure of critical nodes causes cascading failures as load is transferred onto surviving lines, overloading them and causing them to trip out. Within minutes to hours, the synchronized grid, a delicate dance of alternating current frequency maintained across millions of square miles, would disintegrate into powerless fragments and then go completely dark. This is not a blackout. It is a black start scenario of the worst kind, where the generating plants themselves are cut off from their transmission networks and lack the power to restart themselves, even if their primary fuel source, gas, coal, nuclear reactor, is intact. The entire system must be rebooted from zero, a process that normally relies on small black start generators to slowly energize sections of the grid. But if the transformers that connect those generators to the grid are melted husks, the black start becomes impossible. The immediate aftermath of the lights going out is only the prelude. The real collapse occurs in the days and weeks that follow, as every system that depends on continuous electrical power unravels. Phase 1, the first 24 hours, confusion and isolation. As the grid fails, battery backups kick in for critical facilities and telecommunications. Society grapples with the scale of the outage. Cell phones work until tower batteries die, 4 or 8 hours. Social media is ablaze with speculation before the networks fail. Most people assume it's a local, fixable problem. Emergency services are overwhelmed with calls but hampered by failing communications and traffic gridlock as fuel pumps and traffic lights fail. A strange quiet descends as the omnipresent electronic hum of civilization ceases. Phase 2. Days 2 to 7, the cascades begin. This is when dependency becomes critical. Water pressure drops and taps run dry. Refrigerated food spoils. Gas stations close. Hospitals exhaust generator fuel. Pharmacies can't refrigerate insulin or vaccines. ATM networks are dead. Cash becomes scarce. Without electronic payment systems, commerce halts. Supply chains for food, water and medicine, operating on just-in-time logistics with less than 72 hours of buffer, snap. Grocery stores are emptied in the first 48 hours and are not restocked. Law enforcement, without effective communication and facing their own family crises, struggles to maintain order as scarcity bites. Phase 3. Week 2 and beyond. Societal fracture. The focus shifts from inconvenience to survival. Without water treatment, cholera, typhoid and dysentery emerge. Without refrigeration, foodborne illness spreads. Chronic medical patients, dialysis, oxygen therapy, begin to die. The breakdown of waste removal creates pestilence. Social cohesion, stressed by hunger, thirst, and fear, fractures. The tools of the state, digital records, electronic communications, rapid mobility, are gone. Recovery is not in sight because the prerequisite for recovery, the power grid, is not damaged but destroyed at its core. The manufacturing plants that build replacement transformers are idle, dark, and inaccessible. This grim progression is not speculative fiction. It is the consensus outcome of multiple wargame scenarios conducted by government agencies, like FEMA and the DOE, grid reliability organisations, like NOAA, and reinsurance giants, like Lloyd's of London. The 2008 National Academy of Sciences report, Severe Space Weather Events, Understanding Societal and Economic Impacts, laid it out in dry, terrifying detail. The insurance industry has labelled it an uninsurable risk due to the systemic correlated nature of the losses. And yet, against this backdrop of meticulously modelled doom, our preparedness is a patchwork of voluntary guidelines and insufficient action. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, has implemented standards requiring grid operators to assess vulnerability and develop plans, but mandates for installing expensive blocking devices, like GIC blocking transformers or capacitor banks, are weak. The stockpile of spare EHV transformers is negligible. Hardening the entire US grid is estimated to cost tens of billions of dollars, a sum deemed prohibitive for a low-probability event, even if its impact is existential. This is the ultimate irony of Carrington 2.0. We see it coming. We understand the physics perfectly. We have mapped our own vulnerability in exquisite detail, and we have chosen, collectively, to accept the risk rather than pay the premium to insure against it. We have optimized our world for efficiency and cost, not for resilience and survival. The Sun, however, does not care about our cost-benefit analyses. It operates on its own cycles, its own laws. AR 4294-4296 is a testament to its capricious power. The December 4th-7 window is the aperture through which this ghost from 1859 could step into our present. It would not arrive with the charming anecdotes of telegraph operators sending messages on auroral current. It would arrive with the sound of transformers exploding in substations, the silent dying of screens, and the slow, dreadful realization that the world that existed yesterday is gone, perhaps for a decade. The question is no longer if the Sun can do this. The Australia blackout proved it can. The question is whether the specific monstrous machine it has built, AR 4296, will execute the command during the specific window when we are most exposed. We are waiting to see if a ghost can become a reality, and in that wait the very foundations of our global society feel suddenly, terrifyingly thin. The threat posed by AR 4296 is not a singular freak occurrence. It is the most glaring symptom of a deeper, more systemic anomaly. Solar Cycle 25 is not behaving as predicted. Its violent, unexpected upswing in activity has rewritten the forecast models in real time and suggests we may be entering a prolonged period of elevated risk, rather than facing a one-off scare. This unspoken pattern is critical context, transforming a tense week in December 2025 from a potential crisis into a potential harbinger. When Solar Cycle 25 officially commenced in December 2019, the consensus among solar physicists, based on precursor indicators like polar magnetic field strength and helioseismic data, was clear. It would be a weak cycle, perhaps even quieter than its already subdued predecessor, Cycle 24. The models pointed to a peak in sunspot number around 2025 that would be mild, unremarkable. The implication for space weather was comforting. We could expect the usual occasional disruptions to radio communications and satellite operations, but the probability of a civilization-threatening Carrington-level event would remain nestled within the comfortable long-term odds of 1–2% per decade. The Sun, it seemed, was entering a gentle phase. The universe, as it so often does, had other plans. Beginning in late 2024, the observational data began to sharply diverge from the predicted curves. Sunspot numbers didn't just climb, they ascended a steeper slope. The Royal Observatory of Belgium's Solar Influences Data Analysis Centre, SIDC, the official keeper of the sunspot record, found itself repeatedly revising its monthly values upward. More concerning than the raw count was the nature of the spots emerging. They weren't the small, stable, short-lived spots of a weak cycle. They were large, magnetically complex and persistent. The frequency of M-class flares increased. Then, by early 2025, X-class flares, supposed to be rare events even at maximum, began appearing with disquieting regularity. It was as if the Sun had skipped the opening act and jumped straight to the climactic scenes. This overperformance is not merely a statistical curiosity, it has profound implications for tail risk, the probability of extreme outlier events. The Sun's magnetic behavior is governed by a chaotic, nonlinear dynamo. Think of it like an economic system. Under normal conditions, you expect a certain range of market fluctuations. But if the underlying engine of that economy starts running hotter, higher money supply, frenzied speculation, the average level of activity rises, but more importantly, the volatility increases. The system becomes more prone to wild swings, to crashes and booms that fall far outside the previous bell curve. The solar dynamo, by generating more magnetic flux than our models anticipated, hasn't just raised the average solar weather, it has fattened the tails of the probability distribution. The chance of a Carrington-level event, or something even worse, is no longer a static 1% per decade based on historical averages. It is a dynamic probability that has almost certainly increased, perhaps significantly, for the duration of this unexpectedly violent cycle. History offers sobering precedents for cycles that defied forecasts. Solar Cycle 19, which peaked in 1958, was initially predicted to be moderate. It turned out to be the strongest cycle in recorded history, producing severe geomagnetic storms like the one in February 1956 that caused global radio blackouts and spectacular auroras. Cycle 22, peaking around 1990, also overshot predictions and delivered the March 1989 storm that blacked out Quebec. In both cases, the surprise was not a single monster storm, but a sustained period of high activity that created multiple windows of opportunity for disaster. Cycle 25 is now following this disconcerting script. The frequent X-flares and complex active regions of 2024-2025 are not isolated. They are markers of a hyperactive state. This violent upswing forces a brutal reassessment of our preparedness. Almost all critical infrastructure planning, for power grids, satellites, pipelines, is based on statistical models derived from past solar behavior. Those models use 100-year storm benchmarks, often extrapolated from the Carrington Event and the Quebec 1989 storm. But if the Sun is in a phase where it is capable of producing such events more frequently, or even more powerful ones, our 100-year defences might be facing a 50-year or 20-year event reality. The levees are built for a known historical flood stage, but the river is now rising from a deeper, more turbulent source. The public and political perception gap compounds the danger. Having been told for years that Cycle 25 would be mild, the mainstream consciousness has filed solar storms back under the category of interesting but irrelevant natural phenomena, alongside meteor showers and planetary alignments. This narrative is reinforced by the lack of immediate tangible consequences from the increased flaring. Each X-flare that causes a temporary radio blackout over an ocean or a brief satellite glitch is reported, if at all, as a minor technical footnote. The cumulative message is that the sun is active but not dangerous. This perception is a catastrophic misreading of the situation. It confuses the symptom, individual flares, with the underlying disease, a sustained period of high geomagnetic threat. Within scientific and policy circles, a more insidious form of dismissal often occurs, the tail risk discount. Because extreme solar storms are statistically rare over human timescales, there is a powerful psychological and economic incentive to downplay them. Acknowledging that a Carrington-level event has a meaningfully higher probability in the coming years would force expensive, disruptive action, mandating grid hardening, requiring satellite radiation hardening, creating strategic reserves of transformers. It is politically and economically easier to cite the low annual probability and maintain the status quo, hoping the dice continue to roll in our favour. This is a form of cognitive negligence, a collective gamble with civilization as the stake. AR 4296, therefore, must be seen not as an aberration, but as an emblem. It is the physical manifestation of Cycle 25's rule-breaking vigour. Its massive size and complexity are exactly what you would expect to see in the peak of a strong cycle, not in its later stages. Its appearance now signals that the rule-book of solar behaviour we have relied upon may be incomplete or temporarily obsolete. If this cluster can exist now, what else might the sun conjure in the months or years before this volatile cycle truly begins to wane? The implications are clear. We are not in a one-week crisis. We are in a heightened threat epoch that could last for several years. The December 47 window is merely the first major test of this new reality, the first time a region of such clear, unambiguous danger has aimed directly at us during this period of elevated activity. There will be other clusters. There will be other windows. The dice are being rolled not just once, but repeatedly over the coming solar rotations. Sooner or later, statistical probability dictates that a direct hit from a major CME will occur. The only questions are when and how powerful. The unspoken pattern of Cycle 25's violence demands a fundamental shift in mindset. We must move from thinking about the solar storm event to thinking about an era of solar storm risk. Preparedness can no longer be a theoretical exercise for a distant future. It must be an urgent, ongoing priority. Grid operators need to accelerate the installation of GIC monitoring and mitigation devices. Satellite operators must re-evaluate the radiation tolerance of their fleets. Governments need to invest in strategic stockpiles of critical components and establish robust, pre-planned emergency response protocols for a long-duration, continent-scale blackout. The cost of inaction has been recalibrated upward by the sun itself. To ignore the pattern is to sleep through the escalating tremors that precede the Great Quake. AR 4294-4296 is the loudest tremor yet. It may not be the last, and the next one could be the main shock. While the Carrington Event represents the worst-case scenario in the modern instrumental record, geology whispers of far more terrifying possibilities. The existence of these events, discovered not by astronomers but by paleoclimatologists digging into ancient ice and tree rings, forces a humbling and horrifying realization. Our sun is capable of violence that dwarfs even 1859's cataclysm. These are the Miyake events, named for the scientist who first identified their signature, and they represent a ceiling of solar fury we are only beginning to comprehend. AR 4294-4296 is almost certainly not a Miyake-level threat, but its existence during an overperforming cycle forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The boundary between a Carrington and a Miyake is defined by physics we do not fully understand, and our civilization is utterly defenseless against the latter. The discovery was made in 2012 by Japanese physicist Fusa Miyake. Analysing the carbon-14 content in precisely dated tree rings from the years 774-775 CE, she found a colossal, abrupt spike in concentrations. Carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope formed when high-energy cosmic rays strike nitrogen atoms in the upper atmosphere. The spike Miyake found was approximately 20 times larger than the normal background variation, and about twice as large as the signal from the strongest known solar event in the modern era. The inescapable conclusion was that an enormous blast of cosmic radiation had bathed Earth in those years. The most plausible source? An extreme solar proton event, orders of magnitude more powerful than anything recorded since. Subsequent research unearthed similar spikes in the years 993 CE, 660 BCE, and potentially several other dates stretching back millennia. These Miyake events appear to occur, on average, once every 1,000 years or so. But averages are deceptive in a chaotic system. They could come in clusters or with long quiet gaps. The physical mechanism remains hotly debated. One leading hypothesis is the super flare, a stellar explosion on our own sun so energetic it makes an X-class flare look like a matchstick. Some solar-type stars have been observed producing such super flares, releasing energy 10 to 10,000 times greater than the Carrington flare. Another theory involves an extremely fast, dense coronal mass ejection that acts as a colossal particle accelerator, ramping protons and other nuclei to near-relativistic speeds in a shockwave that precedes the plasma cloud itself. Whatever the cause, the effects of a Miyake event striking Earth today would be apocalyptic in a way that makes the Carrington 2.0 scenario seem almost manageable. We can model the impacts in 3 terrifying layers. First, the immediate radiological onslaught. A flux of high-energy protons millions of times greater than normal would inundate near-Earth space within tens of minutes of the initiating flare. Satellites would not just malfunction, their electronics would be fried into permanent oblivion by the particle bombardment. Solar panels would be degraded catastrophically. The entire orbital infrastructure, communications, GPS, weather monitoring, spy satellites, the International Space Station would be destroyed or disabled in a single stroke. Astronauts caught outside shielded compartments would receive a lethal radiation dose in hours. At aviation altitudes, passengers and crew on polar and high-altitude routes could suffer acute radiation sickness. The radiation storm would be an immediate global technological kill shot. Second, the amplified geomagnetic assault. If accompanied by a CME, as is likely, the geomagnetic storm would be of incomprehensible scale. The induced currents, GICs, in power grids wouldn't just damage transformers, they would vaporize them. The long-distance transmission grid would be physically destroyed, with conductors melting and substations erupting in fire. The blackout would be total and permanent on a continental scale. But the damage would extend far beyond the grid. Any long conductor, underground pipelines, railway electrification lines, transoceanic communication cables, would act as an antenna, suffering severe damage. The pulse could even induce currents in undersea cables, destroying their delicate repeaters and severing the global internet's backbone. Third, the atmospheric and biological consequences. This is the most insidious and long-term layer. The cascade of high-energy particles would violently ionize the atmosphere, creating vast amounts of nitrogen oxides. These compounds would catalytically destroy stratospheric ozone. The result would be a sudden, dramatic thinning of the ozone layer, potentially for years, leading to a surge in ground-level ultraviolet B radiation. This would cause widespread crop failure, ecosystem collapse, and a global spike in skin cancers and cataracts. There is also speculative research suggesting such particle events could influence cloud nucleation and regional climate patterns, triggering unpredictable weather shifts and compounding the agricultural disaster. The societal collapse following a Miyake event would be so total and so prolonged that recovery in any recognizable form becomes questionable. With all satellites gone, the grid a smouldering ruin, global communications severed, and a damaged atmosphere threatening food production, the complex interconnected edifice of global civilization would not just be knocked down, its very foundations would be shattered. The scale of simultaneous failure would exceed global manufacturing and recovery capacity for generations. It would be a mass extinction event for technological society. The connection to AR 4294-4296 and the December 2025 window is not one of direct probability. The odds of a Miyake event in any given year are vanishingly small, perhaps 0.1%. This cluster is not exhibiting the truly unprecedented characteristics that might hint at such an outcome. However, its very existence during a cycle that has already defied predictions serves as a stark reminder of the Miyake problem. It proves that our models of solar behavior are incomplete. The sun has a wildcard mode, and we have only fragmentary evidence of what it looks like from the scant geological record. The philosophical and existential implications are profound. For centuries, humanity has operated under the comforting assumption that Earth is a sheltered island in a gentle cosmic neighbourhood. The discovery of Miyake Event shatters that illusion. We live in the blast zone of a capricious star. Our technological ascent has occurred during an uncharacteristically quiet period in solar history, a fact of immense luck we have mistaken for a permanent condition. We have built a wondrous, fragile house of glass on the slopes of a volcano we believed was extinct, only to find charcoal layers in the soil telling of past eruptions that would have buried us in ash. Thus, while we monitor AR 4294-4296 for a Carrington-level threat, the ghost of Miyake lurks in the background of every serious discussion about space weather. It is the ultimate tail risk, the black swan of solar physics. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Is modern civilization, with its hyper-efficiency and planetary scale dependencies, a sustainable proposition in a universe that occasionally produces such events? Have we, in our pursuit of progress, painted ourselves into an evolutionary corner where a single, natural cosmic outburst could erase us? We are not powerless. Research into Miyake events must be intensified to understand their triggers. Investment in extreme space weather forecasting and early warning is a survival imperative, and at the very least, acknowledging this existential risk should galvanize action against the more probable Carrington-level threat. Hardening the grid, creating strategic reserves, and developing resilient satellite architectures are not just prudent steps for a bad solar storm. They are the first, feeble steps towards building a civilization that might one day withstand a Miyake. To ignore the problem because it is rare is to gamble with the entire human project. The sun has shown us, in the rings of ancient trees, what it is capable of. It would be the height of folly to assume it will never do so again. The narrative of solar storm catastrophe often focuses on Earth, on melting transformers and dark cities, but an equally critical and far more immediate battlefield exists 250 miles overhead and beyond, the orbital realm. Our civilization doesn't just live on Earth, it lives within a fragile, invisible shell of technology we have spun around it. Satellites are the unseen connective tissue of the modern world, and they are exquisitely, disproportionately vulnerable to the very space weather they help us monitor. A severe solar storm doesn't just threaten to turn the lights off below, it threatens to blind and deafen us from above, triggering a cascade of failures that would make managing a terrestrial crisis impossible. The dependency is total and largely invisible. The Global Positioning System, GPS, is the most glaring example. We use it to navigate, yes, but its true criticality lies in its function as an ultra-precise global timekeeper. The atomic clocks on GPS satellites broadcast a timing signal used to synchronize financial trading networks, timestamping transactions to the microsecond, coordinate telecommunications data packet routing, and, crucially, synchronize the alternating current phases across vast power grids. The entire digital heartbeat of the global economy is paced by GPS time. Beyond timing, satellites enable global communications, TV, internet, secure military links, weather forecasting, climate monitoring, agriculture, resource management, and national security. We have woven them into the fabric of reality to the point where their absence is almost unthinkable. A powerful coronal mass ejection attacks this orbital infrastructure in multiple simultaneous ways, each more damaging than the last. 1. The particle onslaught. As the CME's shockwave and following plasma cloud envelop Earth, it pumps enormous energy into the Van Allen radiation belts and floods near-Earth space with high-energy protons and electrons from the Sun itself. Satellites are bombarded. This causes single-event upsets, SEWs, bit flips in computer memory that can corrupt data or send erroneous commands. More permanently, it causes cumulative radiation damage to solar panels, reducing their power output, and to electronics, gradually degrading performance until failure. In a severe storm, this damage can be immediate and catastrophic, frying sensitive components outright. 2. Surface charging and electrostatic discharge. Different parts of a satellite can accumulate different electrical charges in a stormy space environment. When the potential difference becomes too great, it discharges in a miniature lightning bolt across the spacecraft, an electrostatic discharge, ESD. This arc can burn out sensitive circuitry, destroy sensors, or create phantom commands that send the satellite tumbling out of control. 3. The drag crisis, a silent killer. This is perhaps the most insidious threat, particularly for satellites in low Earth orbit, LEO, altitudes from 100 to 1,200 miles. A severe geomagnetic storm dumps immense energy into Earth's upper atmosphere, the thermosphere and exosphere, causing it to heat up and expand dramatically. The rarefied gases at these altitudes, normally negligible, become denser. For satellites orbiting through this suddenly thicker medium, atmospheric drag increases exponentially. A satellite expecting to stay aloft for decades can find its orbit decaying at a rate of kilometers per day. Orbit predictions become useless. Satellites can be dragged down prematurely, burning up in the atmosphere. Worse, this uncontrolled decay dramatically increases the risk of catastrophic collisions with other satellites and the ever-growing cloud of space debris. A single collision in a congested orbital shell, like the popular 500-600 kilometer altitude used by many imaging and communication constellations, can create thousands of new debris fragments, each a hypervelocity bullet capable of destroying another satellite, potentially triggering a chain reaction known as the Kessler syndrome. A major storm could, in effect, sweep the sky clean through drag and collision, rendering vital orbits unusable for generations. Internal studies by space agencies like ESA and NASA have modelled these scenarios, and the results are classified for a reason. They are terrifying. An exercise conducted by the European Space Agency in 2025, simulating a Carrington-class storm, concluded that hundreds of satellites could experience uncontrolled orbital decay within days. Constellation geometries, like the precise arrangements of GPS satellites, would be distorted, degrading or eliminating service. Communication networks would fragment as relays failed. Earth observation capabilities, critical for weather, disaster response and security, would go dark. The loss of GPS timing alone would be a systemic shock of the first order. Within hours, financial markets would seize as transaction timestamps became unreliable, inviting chaos and fraud. Telecommunications networks would congest and fail as synchronization is lost. And for power grids already staggering under geomagnetically induced currents, the loss of the precise phase synchronization provided by GPS would be a knockout blow, making it impossible to safely reconnect grid segments or manage load balance. The terrestrial and orbital collapses would feed each other in a vicious, accelerating feedback loop. The fragility is compounded by economics and design philosophy. The drive for smaller, cheaper, faster satellites, the CubeSat revolution, and the mega constellations of thousands of spacecraft often comes at the expense of radiation hardening and robust fault protection. Many commercial satellites are built with commercial off-the-shelf, COTS, electronics never designed for the rigors of a severe radiation environment. They are efficient, but they are not resilient. The assumption has been that space is a stable environment, with radiation risks managed statistically over a satellite's planned lifetime. A Carrington or Miyake-level event violates that assumption completely, delivering a lifetime's worth of radiation damage in a day. Furthermore, there is no rapid replacement capacity for a decimated orbital fleet. Satellites take years to design, build, and launch. Launch facilities themselves are vulnerable to terrestrial power and supply chain failures from the same storm. If a significant portion of the world's satellite infrastructure is disabled or destroyed, we would be thrust back decades in terms of global coordination, communication, and knowledge. Precisely at the moment we would need those capabilities most to manage the unfolding catastrophe on the ground. This orbital house of cards represents a hidden weak link of breathtaking scope. We have placed the nervous system of our global civilization in the most exposed environment possible, the very frontier where the sun's fury is felt first and most directly. As we watch AR 4294, 4296, we are not just watching for a threat to our power lines, we are watching for a threat to our eyes and ears in the sky. A direct hit from a major CME would likely be a two-stage disaster. First, the silent, swift destruction and disruption of the orbital layer within hours. Second, the slower, more visibly dramatic collapse of the terrestrial grid over the following day. By the time the lights go out on Earth, we may already be blind, deaf, and lost, our digital compass shattered. The vulnerability is not theoretical. It is engineered into the very architecture of 21st century life, hanging by a thread in the solar wind. In the face of the threat posed by AR 4294-4296 and the volatile cycle it represents, the most unsettling phenomenon is not on the Sun but on Earth, the profound, deliberate silence from the institutions built to protect us. This silence is not an absence of knowledge, it is the product of knowledge. It is a calculated institutional stance born from a toxic cocktail of liability fears, economic constraints, political risk aversion, and a tragic misjudgment about public panic. In the quiet rooms of agencies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and the national security apparatus, the scenarios have been gamed. The vulnerability assessments have been filed. The conclusions are grim, unambiguous, and largely secret. The public lives in a carefully maintained bubble of ignorance, while those in charge hope the cosmic roulette wheel never lands on the wrong number. The documentary evidence of this understanding is real, but obscure. FERC, following a congressional mandate after the 2003 blackout, has overseen the development of reliability standards for the bulk power system, including those related to geomagnetic disturbances. The resulting standards, developed by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, require utilities to conduct vulnerability assessments and develop mitigation plans. The internal reports generated by these assessments are not publicized. They detail, in cold engineering terms, how specific transformers at specific substations would likely fail under specific levels of geomagnetically induced current. They model cascading failures. They estimate blackout durations and recovery timelines. The conclusions are consistent. A Carrington-level event would cause widespread catastrophic transformer failure, leading to prolonged blackouts affecting tens of millions for months or years. Similar studies have been conducted by national laboratories, by reinsurance giants like Lloyd's of London, and by think tanks. The 2008 National Academy of Sciences report is a public-facing summary of this consensus, but its terrifying conclusions, trillions in damage, 10-year recovery, are couched in academic language and have been gathering dust on policy shelves for over a decade. More recent classified tabletop exercises run by government continuity planners have explored the day-after scenarios, how to maintain command and control, distribute food and water, and prevent societal collapse when the grid is gone and satellites are down. The participants from these exercises often emerge visibly shaken. So why the silence? The reasons are multifaceted and perverse. 1. The liability shield. For a government agency or a regulated utility, publicly acknowledging a specific catastrophic vulnerability in critical infrastructure is an invitation to legal and political hell. If a storm hits and they haven't fixed the problem, which would cost tens of billions, they are exposed to claims of negligence. If they raise the alarm and the storm doesn't materialize, they are accused of fear-mongering and wasting resources. The safest legal and bureaucratic course is to manage the risk quietly through internal technical channels, issue vague, probabilistic public advisories, and avoid any definitive, frightening statements that could be held against them later. 2. The economic bottleneck. Hardening the North American power grid against a severe geomagnetic storm is a monumental undertaking. It would require installing blocking devices, like series capacitors or neutral current blockers, on thousands of critical transformers, creating strategic reserves of spare transformers, and potentially redesigning grid architectures for greater decentralization. Estimates run from $20 billion to over $100 billion. For investor-owned utilities, this is capital expenditure with zero return unless a disaster strikes. For regulators, approving rate hikes to pay for it is politically unpalatable. The economic incentive is to delay, to study further, to implement only the cheapest, most minimal mitigations. The staggering cost of inaction is a future, hypothetical problem. The cost of action is a present, certain bill. 3. The fear of panic. This is the most paternalistic and arguably the most flawed rationale. The belief in corridors of power is that the public cannot handle the truth about such a profound vulnerability. The assumption is that clear communication about the risk of a long-term civilization-scale blackout would trigger hoarding, bank runs, social unrest, and economic contraction, creating a crisis where none yet exists. This mindset prioritizes short-term stability over informed public preparedness. It denies citizens the agency to make their own preparations, however meagre, storing water, having cash, owning a radio, and it prevents the public pressure that might force political action on hardening infrastructure. 4. Strategic denial. Governments are reluctant to publicly highlight systemic vulnerabilities, as it is seen as a sign of weakness and can invite scrutiny of national preparedness. It is easier to frame resilience as a technical, behind-the-scenes issue for engineers than as a frontline national security priority requiring wartime levels of investment and mobilization. Admitting that a natural phenomenon could cripple the nation more effectively than any foreign adversary is an uncomfortable truth that conflicts with traditional security paradigms. The result of this institutional silence is a catastrophic preparedness gap. The public is unaware and therefore unpressured. Politicians, reflecting their constituents' concerns, do not prioritize it. Funding for grid hardening is minuscule compared to the need. Research into advanced warning and mitigation is underfunded. The transformer manufacturing base remains limited. Satellite operators prioritize cost over radiation hardness. We are like passengers on an ocean liner being steered toward a known iceberg field, while the captain's bridge issues announcements about the fine dining and evening entertainment, believing that warning us might cause a stampede to the lifeboats. The lifeboats, in our case, are largely non-existent. This silence becomes morally indefensible as the threat window, like the one from December 4-7, 2025, opens. When the specialists are watching the data with rising alarm and the public remains blissfully ignorant, the burden of consequence shifts entirely. If the worst happens, the post-event inquiry will not ask, "Why did the sun erupt?" It will ask, "Why weren't we warned? Why wasn't more done?" And the answer will be found in the filed-away reports, the watered-down public bulletins, and the calculated decision to prioritize institutional comfort over public safety. The cosmic irony is that the sun is the ultimate transparent actor. Its processes are visible, its eruptions detectable. Our failure is not one of observation, but of communication and courage. AR 42294, 42296 is a test, not just of our infrastructure's resilience, but of our institutions' integrity. Will they choose to break the silence, even at the 11th hour, to allow for even minimal preparation? Or will they maintain the quiet, hoping to avoid blame if the gun remains unfired and guaranteeing catastrophic blame if it goes off? In the gap between what is known and what is said, the fate of millions may hang. We stand now at the precipice, looking into the December window. The monstrous sunspot cluster AR 4294 496 is aimed. The solar wind stream is en route to prime our defences. The models have sketched the spectrum of possible futures, from minor disruption to civilizational collapse. We have confronted the silent pattern of a violent solar cycle, the ghost of Miyake events, the fragility of our orbital necklace, and the institutional muteness that leaves us exposed. The final, unifying theme is one of interconnected fragility. We have not built a resilient machine. We have woven a web of astonishing efficiency that is terrifyingly vulnerable to a specific known stressor from the cosmos. We live at the edge of chaos, in a civilization optimized for a calm that the universe is not obligated to provide. The days ahead are a real-time experiment in cosmic probability. Forecasters will watch the X-ray flux graphs, the coronagraphs, and the magnetometer data from the ACE and DS-COVA spacecraft. The tension will not be in a public panic, but in the quiet, professional dread of those who understand the plots on those screens. They will wait for the signature of a major flare, followed by the expanding halo in SOHO's imagery that signifies a CME launch. From that moment, a countdown will begin, anywhere from 18 to 48 hours. The final critical data will be the solar wind parameters from L1, giving perhaps 30 minutes of definitive warning about the magnetic orientation that will decide our fate. In that final hour, a handful of grid operators and emergency managers will face an impossible choice. Do they initiate partial grid shutdowns based on a probabilistic forecast, potentially causing localized blackouts and economic disruption for a threat that might be a near miss? Or do they hold, risking the complete destruction of their infrastructure for the sake of keeping the lights on a little longer? Historically, the choice has always been to hold. The system is biased towards inaction, because the consequences of a false alarm are career-ending, while the consequences of a disaster can be attributed to an act of God. This is the core of our vulnerability. It is as much a failure of decision-making architecture and risk psychology as it is of engineering. We have built a system too complex and too fast for our human institutions to manage in a crisis measured in minutes. We have centralized control in a way that creates single points of catastrophic failure, both in our grid topology and in our command structures. The just-in-time philosophy that governs our supplies of food, fuel, and medicine is the economic mirror of this fragility. It eliminates buffers in the name of efficiency, ensuring that any shock propagates instantly and completely. As we close this examination, the question is not merely about R4294-4296. This cluster will rotate out of view by mid-December. It may fire harmlessly into space. It may produce a severe storm that we weather with damage but not collapse. But the underlying conditions remain. Solar cycle 25 is still violent and unpredictable. The sun will produce more large clusters. The odds will reset, but they will not reset to zero. The dice will be rolled again and again. Therefore, the imperative that emerges from this moment is not to simply survive this window, but to learn from it. The warning must be heeded, even if the worst is avoided. The silent pattern must be shouted. The institutional silence must be broken by an informed and angry public demanding action. The investments in grid hardening, satellite resilience, strategic reserves, and robust emergency protocols must be made, not as a discretionary expense, but as a non-negotiable insurance premium for the continuation of technological civilization. We have been gifted with foresight. We can see the threat coming, not in days, but in cycles. We understand the physics of our own destruction. This is a privilege no civilization facing an asteroid impact or a supervolcano ever had. To squander this warning by clinging to complacency, silence, and short-term economics is a form of suicide by neglect. The cosmos is indifferent. The sun will continue its cycles, its flares, its eruptions. It is not hostile, it is simply powerful. The responsibility for resilience lies entirely with us, the fragile inhabitants of the third rock. We have built a wondrous, glittering house on the shore. We have known for decades that a tidal wave is possible. We have now seen the water recede farther than ever before, a classic sign that the wave may be coming. We can argue about the exact probability, we can hope it's just a tidal fluctuation, or we can start moving to higher ground. The choice defines our future. AR4294-4226 is the receding water. The question is whether we'll see it as a curiosity or as the final warning.